Welcome to the show. Today, a really interesting friend of mine, Renee DiResta. She's a researcher who studies influence operations and propaganda in the context of pseudoscience conspiracies, terrorist activity, and state-sponsored information warfare. Today, we're going to focus on Russian influence operations online, so election hacking via social media. There's a lot to this. It's a really big show, so we're going to jump right in. All right, enjoy. How did this get on your radar? I know this sort of started with you trying to do the impossible, which is find a preschool for your kids.
Yes. So I had my first son in December 2013, and in California and San Francisco, you have to get on these waiting lists like a
Mm.
year ahead of when you want it. So in December 2014 was when I had to get him on these lists. Anyway, I started Googling around, looking for schools, but also I wanted to look at the vaccination rates because that had come up. I used to live in New York, and it was kind of required, but in California, you could just opt out because of personal beliefs. You could just say, "We're not going to vaccinate," and that's it. Philosophical exemption. So I didn't wanna go to a school like that.
Hmm.
And I downloaded a bunch of data, and was really disturbed by how the rates had been really trending down over time. And I wrote a blog post about it late November, looking at, like, how private schools were a million times worse, how Waldorf schools were an absolute disaster, just trying to say, like, California parents, like, we should be demanding better here. I called my local representative. I'd never done that before, but I felt, like,
That's such a
compelled.
Karen move.
I was so annoyed. I was like, "Come on, like, how is it that there's, like, no, there's schools with, like, 30%, 30% immunization rates?" And I was like, "What the hell is going on here? Like, I can't we do something about that? Why do we have these exemptions?" And, yeah, and they were like, "Yeah, no, nothing to do. Nothing to do about that, good luck." And then the Disneyland measles outbreak happened a month later, and I called back again, and I was like, "Hey, how about now?" And they were like, "Actually, yeah, we have a senator in Sacramento who's going to be instituting, it's kind of introducing a bill to deal with that situation, remove the exemptions." And I said, "I'd love to help. Maybe I could, do some data analysis for you guys. I'd love to just be useful in some way." And so they put me in touch with two other moms, and we started this group called Vaccinate California. And by started a group, I mean, we made a Facebook page, just to be clear.
Yeah.
There was no legal filings. There was nothing that, that this was going to be like a big deal. We didn't really know what we were getting into. So we just made a Facebook page. And I started running Facebook ads because we needed people to call and to say, to support the bill. And so I started running Facebook ads, and I learned how to do ad targeting and lookalike audiences and a bunch of other kind of more sophisticated ad targeting tools. And in the course of doing that, we also started kind of putting out content about the bill on Twitter. And I was like part of SF Tech. I been on Twitter for years and was kind of completely blown away by like activism Twitter, particularly by how well organized the anti-vaccine movement already was. And the way in which these fake accounts would kind of come out of nowhere, they would say that they were from California, they'd been created yesterday. They were communicating, they were being given instructions on YouTube videos that were being put out every night saying, these are the hashtags you're going after. Here's the memes you're going to use. Here's the folder with the memes in them. And I was kind of like, wow, this is a really amazingly organized operation. Um, on Facebook, what I started noticing was if you searched for vaccine for running any of your ad targeting, what it started giving you was anti-vaccine suggestions. So if you typed in vaccine, it would push you a bunch of anti-vaccine topics, and you could target anti-vaxxers really easily. But I was like, well, how do I find like parents who want high immunization levels in their schools? Like, and then I realized that there was like this asymmetry, right? Like most people vaccinate, but they don't stop to think about it. They definitely don't become activists about it. They vaccinate their kids, nothing happens. They move on with their lives, and they don't get on social media to talk about how nothing happened. So I was kind of struck by this asymmetry and by saying like, okay, how do we rectify this? Because it seems like all of the algorithmic boosts are driving things in the other direction. And so I started looking at mapping the network. So I did some network analysis with a data scientist named Galad Ten, and we started looking at how the anti-vaccine parents on Twitter, who had been anti-vaccine for years and years and years, were beginning to reach out to the Tea Party, for example, to some of the militia movements, to some of the Second Amendment activists, all of which are, again, like kind of communities that had been on Twitter for a really long time.
I haven't
But
heard about
when
the Tea Party in like in a
I know
minute.
it was the Tea Party in
Yeah.
like 2015, 20, like
Yeah.
late
That was some
2015,
Sarah
early, it
Palin
was early
stuff right there.
2015.
Yeah.
It really was. So this was before the kind of, this was way before the 2016 campaign. This was all happening in January to June 2015 or so. So pretty early on. Um, and I started writing about how social networks were enabling different kind of persistent factions of people, different communities to find each other, and to find, to kind of like marry hashtags was what the anti-vaccine kind of activists called it. So that if you wanted to push your anti-vaccine content into Tea Party communities, you would use the Tea Party hashtags alongside yours, and then they were kind of using these basic marketing tactics actually for policy activism. And I thought that was really interesting because it made me feel like everything was going to be a marketing campaign for an idea. Any policy that went out the door from now on was effectively going to use these tactics. And so the people who were most adept at deploying them were going to be the groups that got their message heard, because what mattered was share of voice, right? On social media, what matters is how much of your audience can you reach? Can your meme become the sticky thing that everybody says? Is your content, does it have virality potential where it's going to be forwarded along? How are regular people going to see your content and engage with it? How are influencers going to pick up your content and engage with it? And so I started looking a lot at the dynamics of just this really one niche bill in California, that was highly politically polarizing. There was a ton of media, content going out about it. I got doxxed. I got harassed. I was not
Sure. Yeah. Of
expecting that
course.
either. You know,
That was a
the way
surprise for you at that time, and now
at
it's
that
like,
time in
oh, of
2015 it was
course.
a surprise. Now it's like obviously right.
Yeah.
And I was sort of like, wow. So also the cost of being a public advocate has really changed now too. I
Oh,
think I'm just like a mom,
right. And
and that's
doxed,
not
by the way,
it.
doxed, by the way, for people that don't know, is like they put all of your personal information online, essentially to say, call Renee DiResta at her place of work and at home and
Yeah.
like bother her and her family because she's doing something bad. So I don't think everyone knows what doxed means, but it's like it's worse for people who aren't already public figures because of course someone can just find your office and call you. You work wherever you work. But it's bad when you're an activist and you have a bunch of crazy people calling your husband's workplace and telling him nasty things about you, which is kind of the point of doing that, right?
Right. And so I used to have a little Tumblr blog where I put up pictures of my kids and, like, well, I had one kid at the time, but, wedding pictures, like just your life, the way that
Hmm.
normal people engage on the internet, locked all that shit down.
Yeah.
Took it all down, it was sort of like, Twitter's response to me when it happened was like, effectively it was like, you're a limited purpose public figure now, like, good luck to you. And they started making YouTube videos about me also. And I was like, I'd never heard that term before. I didn't
What
realize
does
that
that mean?
limited purpose public figure is a legal designation that says that you have chosen to inject yourself into a particular narrowly tailored conversation, which for me was immunization policy in California, which meant that I was a public figure in the context of that topic that I had chosen to engage on. Now, legally, that would mean if I were to file a defamation suit, I would have to, prove an intent to harm as opposed to just, intent to harass, which is protections are different for these different tiers of publicness, I guess. And I thought that was bizarre too, because I thought, well, in the age of social media, anybody who, again, like throws up a Facebook page, puts up a Twitter account, and weighs in on a conversation, if the internet gets mad at them and turns them into a public figure, like, boom, there you go.
Right. You
You're
don't
in it
have a
now.
choice. Like before it was
Right.
you had to run for office. That's one of the sort of traditional public figure occupations that's listed in the law. And it's been a long time since law school, but I think the other one would be like if you were an actual celebrity.
Right.
And
Like
so
regular people would recognize you.
right. And so you have all of the downsides of being a public figure, but none of the real upside of like getting money
Right.
thrown at you to wear Chanel perfume and like getting tables
Or
first
your
at restaurants.
bodyguard.
Right. No, downsides only. Right.
So that was so I had this experience and I thought like, all right, so I'd learned a couple things here. Like we did get the law passed. So, success. And I mean, it was a really hard slog. I was very, very proud of being able to get that done. We were the first state to do it in something like, I think, God, 30 or 40 years to actually
And the law,
change
to be
policy.
clear, was what again?
The law said that you have to have a medical reason to opt your children out of vaccines. That was it.
Gotcha.
You had to have some sort of like medical justification as opposed to I don't want to.
Right.
Yeah. And so that was, so I mean, there reasonable people can disagree on whether, how they feel about that law and where they think the line should be and what the state's obligation or responsibility should be. Um, I feel like reasonable people shouldn't turn that disagreement into doxing, harassing, threatening, and, you know,
Right.
it's where we kind of get into the realm of like what the internet delivered as far as policy conversations versus the olden days where you'd, kind of, fight it out through some op-eds in a newspaper, right?
Right.
Um, so I learned a lot about that. I really felt like I got this introduction into network activism. And I think it was the fact that we took a very quantitative approach to understanding how these groups were operating, how they were networking, how social media algorithms, how curation and amplification were really amplifying this content. And I had been a venture capitalist, so I had done a lot of investing in tech companies and looking at tech business models, looking at implications of technology on society. And I really felt like what I was seeing was this shift, this thing that was going to fundamentally change political campaigning, policy advocacy, um, activism online in a very, very fundamental way. And then what wound up happening for me was the White House reached out and through Todd Park, the former chief technology officer, and he said, he asked me to meet up, and he said, some of the work that you're doing, we're trying to do some similar work, looking at how terrorist organizations are using social media for recruitment, advocacy, and propaganda. We think that the way that you've been writing about this and talking about this, and seeing this develop, is something that we'd like to have you kind of come down to DC and participate in some of our conversations about this in the context of this other group. So that was not, really where I expected my career to go, but that's where it went. So,
Yeah.
so I went to DC for about 3 weeks and worked with a group of people who had done a lot. I was not a counterterrorism expert, but this was ISIS, of course, was what was going on at the time. So what was happening at the same time in mid 2015 was ISIS was beginning to become a really big problem on social networks, particularly Twitter. If you were to follow one account, it would suggest more accounts for you. There were what they called ISIS sort of fanboys. So there were the core accounts that would occasionally post the beheading videos and things. Those would come down quite quickly. Twitter would take those down. But then there were the people who would try to serve as like the amplifiers, or the people who were like, hey, Twitter is censoring this content, but you can go find it over here on this other platform, directing people to things like LiveLeak and other places. So really working to amplify the content, amplify the message. And the thing that we started talking about was what happens when social platforms became kind of vast tools for propaganda. What happened when they became vast amplification tools that really, in a very different way than propaganda had been done in the past, it wasn't being carried out only through the media, it wasn't being carried out only through broadcast or print. It was a participatory process. It was ways in which you could produce content, a meme, a YouTube video. You could go make your own content, and then you could disseminate your own content. And what was happening was these very small organizations were able to follow that process, put the content out, and then real people would come and serve as amplifiers, leaving this question of if you were to take down or delete the accounts of the people who were amplifying it, were you kind of stifling free expression? So this was where that kind of like laundry, the manufacturing process of one group producing the content, but then regular peer-to-peer dissemination was something that we'd not really seen before. It was something that the internet really enabled in a way that prior broadcast mechanisms and print just hadn't, it wasn't really possible.
And this took Washington and everyone by surprise, right? They were thinking like, oh, well, if we find a channel that has ISIS propaganda, we'll just close the channel. We'll just close the website. We'll do something to that. Now, when it's like thousands of users or tens of thousands of users on social media, you have to invent software to track it. And then if you shut that, there's all these free speech issues, right? I assume that they then said, I know there's always like the slippery slope fallacy where it's like, well, if we shut down anti-vax, then what else are we going to shut down? And I would imagine they use that with ISIS. Although, what's the argument? If we shut down beheading videos, then what's next?
No, it was one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And if the US government requests this be taken down, what if a more authoritarian government requests takedowns in the future? That argument
Yeah.
did come up actually. The slippery slope was very much a part of it. There were a couple interesting, questions, right? One was, um, first, it was not a surprise to them. Actually, there had been a DARPA program in 2012 called Social Media and Strategic Communication, SMISC. And because the DARPA program is open, anyone can actually go and read the archives. So anyone who's interested can go read the research that came out of SMISC.
And DARPA is our defense research, kind of like invented the internet and looks at technology in terms of how it can either be weaponized against us or how we can weaponize it. Is that kind of a
Yeah, that's a
layman's
good
overview?
description. I think the motto is to, gosh, what is it? It's to prevent and create strategic surprise, I think is the
That sounds
basically
ominous.
how do you both prevent it and put it to use. It's a Defense Department, Defense Advanced Research Projects. Uh, I don't remember what
Yeah,
the A stands for.
trying to look.
Associate.
Yeah, I'm trying to look. It is. Yeah, I don't see a motto anywhere, but I haven't looked that hard. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. That's what that is. Okay.
So DARPA had this program from 2012 to 2015 called Social Media and Strategic Communication that actually asked this question: what happens if hostile governments, terrorist organizations, unsavory characters begin to use the internet for these kind of nefarious purposes, particularly propaganda and spreading false information. So it was not a surprise. I think the question really became, what could the government do about it, though? And there were certain limitations in place. So at the time, the State Department could counter message, but because of US law that says that the government is not allowed to propagandize to its own citizens, the State Department messages that went out over Twitter, if they might be seen by an American, had to be declared and attributable to the State Department, which meant that the entity that was kind of tweeting back at ISIS sympathizers on Twitter was this US State Department group. That so it's sort of like, well, it's not like the US State Department is really going to defer somebody who's on their way to down this radicalization path to becoming an
Right.
ISIS sympathizer. That's not a realistic kind of authentic, that's not going to be the most well received counter messaging source.
Right.
You're not going to
It's
de-radicalize somebody with a State Department tweet.
it's like the opposite of influencer marketing. It's like
Right.
we want influencers to wear our cool shoes and show how useful they are, and then it's like, please buy our shoes. Like what? No,
Think
no, you're
again,
not
turn
gonna.
away. The
Yeah.
hashtag that they were using was like think again, turn away.
Oh,
It was
brutal.
not the most well executed
No.
early kind of counter operation, but they recognized at least that they had to do something, right? So there was a widespread acceptance of the fact that this was going to be sort of like the new normal, that information war through terrorists, through and at the time, as we were having these conversations in October 2015, we also already knew that Russia was operating on US social platforms. That also was not a surprise. The extent was a surprise. The specifics were a surprise. But at the time, as we were thinking about what would the US government's response to this kind of activity be, what should the tech platform response to this kind of activity be, even in the very narrowly scoped realm of counterterrorism, the question really became, well, if regular domestic, like moms in California can do it, and if ISIS can do it, you better believe that like Russia and China can do it.
Right.
And so it turned into a little bit of like well, maybe the kind of counter messaging entity and the whole of government response to this stuff shouldn't be some random State Department Twitter account. Maybe we should be forward looking and think about the fact that this is, I felt like I couldn't tell if it was like Chicken Little or Cassandra, or it's
Right.
like
Right.
something is changing here. Like I really feel like we should be giving this some like pretty big big guns in terms of get a lot of like the best brains in the country thinking about what's going to happen here, because this seems like this is going to be a disaster. And yeah, I mean, like I said, so Adrian Chen's article about the Internet Research Agency had come out 6 months prior, the article called "The Agency" in the New York Times. So again, the fact that Russia was running fake Facebook pages and doing these things was not news. But the real question became like, what happens when it's all happening on a private platform? So the government doesn't really have that kind of jurisdiction. What are the regulatory mechanisms? How do you compel a platform to take action if you choose to do so?
So, so let me pause for a second because I think a lot of people, they look at Facebook groups and there's an algorithm that's doing some of the work, right? It's not necessarily just information warfare actors from Russia and China. It can be if I join a group that's anti-vax, and I've done that before to see what's going on in there, especially when I do shows about that kind of thing, it's kind of a quick jump to like QAnon, California, right? And like Pizzagate, you know, truthers, 9/11 truthers. Like those are the things that were in the sidebar at the time. It wasn't like biking in the Bay Area, right? It wasn't normal stuff. It was, or you search for COVID-19 or coronavirus. It's not like coronavirus information network. It's like coronavirus truth, coronavirus warriors, coronavirus, whatever. Like it's misinformation rabbit hole that you almost can't even find the real stuff. You just kind of, the algorithm is just like, oh, you believe dumb crap? Here's a lot more dumb crap for you to deal with.
So there's a reason for that. So when you build a social network, particularly if somebody's onboarding, you want to show them things that are relevant to them, which means that you build a recommendation system. And before it has data from the person, before it's instrumented the user and follows their clicks and what they engage with and what they do, you're kind of a blank slate. And so what it does is it does one of two things. It shows you accounts that are geographically relevant. It keys off the information it has to suggest interest based on certain demographic characteristics, certain things that maybe you have selected. But the other thing that it does, so when you engage with content, it can show you more content similar to that type. So that's called content-based filtering. So it says you like gardening. Here's 50 more gardening pages.
Mhm.
Then there's the other thing, which is called collaborative filtering, which is you in its aggregate, in its understanding of who you are based on your clicks and your behavior and your demographics and all of the data that it amasses on you. If you engage with this type of content, people who are statistically similar to you who engage with that content also engage with this other content. So if you engage with gardening, maybe you're also a cook. So even if you've never searched for cooking, we can push cooking stuff at you because 75% of people who like gardening also like to cook, right?
Mhm.
It's an oversimplification, but that's basically how collaborative filtering works. So it says that some percentage of people who like this thing like this other thing. Um, so what happens with conspiracy theories, there are some people who are into the anti-vaccine conspiracy, for example, because they have health, they're concerned about toxins or they're concerned about, kind of the sort of purity people, my baby is born perfect. Why would I inject the thing into them? But then there are other people who are involved in the anti-vaccine movement because they believe that there are vast government cover-ups and the New World Order and the Illuminati and pharma and these sorts of the people who are more on the conspiratorial. Someone somewhere is harming people, and I'm not going to be a victim of that. Those people are more likely to be receptive to other anti-government conspiracies or conspiracies that are alleging that evil, nefarious forces are at work. And that's where you start to see, even if you originally go to the anti-vaccine group because you are a natural health, like juice, person, it still says, well, of the 10,000 people in this group, 7,500 of them are also members of this Pizzagate group. Ergo, we're going to serve you the Pizzagate stuff too, even if you've never gone and seen it. So I also started getting, I had joined a bunch of anti-vaccine groups and pages when we were doing the vaccine law. And so I had this account that was regularly, I was getting recommendations for Pizzagate and for QAnon. And so that kind of conspiracy correlation matrix kind of became pretty clear really early on. And that was another thing where we were trying to flag that and say, hey, maybe, maybe this is one reason why, some radicalization is happening. Maybe pushing ordinary people who have never gone looking for Pizzagate or QAnon and like pushing it to them and saying, hey, you should see this, you should see this, you should see this. Maybe that's not the most kind of ethical design for a recommendation system. Maybe that's not how we want
Yeah.
recommendation systems to work.
Yeah. Remember when we thought cyber warfare was going to be like attacks on power plants and infrastructure, and now it's like your gardening group suddenly links you 3 groups later, and you're talking about how essential oils can cure COVID-19 or drinking bleach can do it. And it's like, unfortunately, that algorithm has sort of mastered finding people who lack critical thinking skills and then like pushing their boundaries a little bit, little by little. And even people who are otherwise sensible can have their boundaries pushed like this, especially if it's done over time and in a calculated way. And it's like this algorithm that's designed to serve you a bunch of ads and keep you on the platform for as long as possible. just happens to also be really good at that, right? Good at pushing people's belief systems.
Yep.
So it's not just the platforms, it's not just the algorithm. You mentioned earlier the Internet Research Agency. I don't think IRA has ever been a good acronym for anything. Not a great track record for that one. What is the Internet Research Agency? Sounds so innocuous. Sounds like an academic think tank.
So it's an entity in Russia, attributed to an individual named Yevgeny Prigozhin. Prigozhin is an oligarch, a Russian businessman with close ties to Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. And the Internet Research Agency began operations in around 2014. I think late 2013 established, 2014 operational. And it originally operated largely as like a comment farm, kind of leaving comments, and then as Twitter became a bigger thing, tweets on content related to topics of interest to the Russian government. So that originally started locally. So Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, MH17, the downing of the jet, the Malaysia Airlines jet over Ukraine, and so it began to its goal was really to kind of nudge the conversation in particular directions, to
Mhm.
distract, to do the things that you would do. You know, China had actually set up an operation called the 50 Cent Party, sometimes called the 50 Cent Army, back in 2004. So again, there are certain entities and certain governments that believe that kind of controlling the narrative first domestically, first within your local kind of sphere of influence. The Internet Research Agency rapidly expanded outward, and by mid 2014, early 2015, was actively targeting Americans as well, American citizens.
Yeah.
So it didn't start as an entity to disrupt the presidential election of 2016. That, of course, is the thing that it's perhaps best known for because of the investigation and the that's been very much a topic of conversation, Russian interference. But it did start several years prior to that, and it was a multi-year operation. It really One thing that's kind of remarkable about it is how it took very old active measures tactics, things that had been carried out in the Cold War, the Soviet era. And I think the real um, insight was that propaganda was going to shift with the shift in technology. And this was something DARPA saw too.
Yeah.
Russia executed on it, right? And prioritized it, actively made it a strategy, actively made it something that it put to use for geopolitical influence operations. And so that was again that recognition that propaganda evolves to fit the information ecosystem or architecture of the day. The new information architecture was social networks. The new information architecture, the means of transmission was peer to peer. So rather than executing simply on old Cold War propaganda tactics of placing an article in a newspaper and kind of laundering a narrative up the chain of newspapers, they realized that you could make a meme, push the meme to people who would be receptive to it, and then have those people act as your disseminators. And it would become this process by which content designed for the internet, designed for people, very much like a extremely modern social media marketing approach to propaganda, was what this entity really kind of took and ran with. And
And they're trying to create tribes, right? These aren't just like meme posters. I know some of the earliest pages were that they created, these like Facebook pages were for the religious community, for the right, and then they kind of like switch morph whatever to black activism, and then it's like Pride, Texas Pride, LGBT Pride, Texas secessionists, and they're targeting these in-group communities. Why are they doing this? What's up with the tribes? And it seems random to somebody like me looking from the outside, or someone that's new to this, looking at LGBT Kansas Pride. How is that possibly related to somebody trying to change an election or trying to change public opinion? It seems so niche. How are the 500 people who are LGBT in Kansas going to do anything? Like, what's the strategy here?
so the internet is really made to help you find people who are like you, right? There's so much of that is built into the design. It's prioritized. It's actively prioritized. This is why Facebook developed groups. You used to go to Facebook with your real friends and you would see what your real friends were putting out there. But if your real friends, either weren't that interesting, weren't that active on the platform, for the platform to keep you there, coming up with this structure of groups is a fantastic way. We help you find new friends. We help you
Hmm.
find new interests. And particularly in a, kind of increasingly polarized US, a lot of that was people who would come to Facebook to kind of like fight the culture wars, right? They find their political, group and get entrenched and become, really active. And you started to see this on Twitter as well. Again, these kind of like persistent groups of people who were really aligned around a particular shared interest. You had your internet friends all of a sudden.
Right.
And sometimes, for people who are more into, like, fighting and trolling, you remember the 2015, 2016 campaign, right? Real Americans are just on there with they put their Pepe the Frog or their blue wave or, whatever, like, you signal now it's like the DSA rose, the
Yeah.
neoliberal, like, globe, whoever you are is like, boom, it's, like, right out there and, your affiliation, you're just wearing it on your little, like,
Yeah.
username line there.
It's the MAGA hat of your social media account, right? Like there's even lobsters. Those I don't know. They're like a Jordan Peterson thing. The
Oh,
rose is
yeah.
socialism. I don't understand why those are that way. I've asked about the rose and I got an explanation, forgot. But yeah, like then there's the blue hat emoji. So anything that
Right,
you
for
can
Andrew
possibly
Yang.
imagine.
The
Yeah, yeah.
avocados for California, kind of making fun of the idea that if you just eat less avocado toast, you can buy a house, you know?
Oh, yeah, there's something to that though, actually. You can at least pay your mortgage with that. So we're wearing this on our sleeve. We're fighting with each other like you can even just find people to mess with by searching for that particular hashtag or
Right.
that particular emoji, right? You can just pick fights
Yeah, and
that way.
so you think of the internet as like a networked series of factions, right? Just this kind of war of all against all. Everybody's out there trolling. What the Internet Research Agency does, their big kind of innovation, is they realize that they can create Facebook pages and they can pretend to be members of these communities. And so the content that's put out is 90% of it is really about um, solidifying that in-group dynamic, right? It's about saying, I, as a Texas secessionist, believe this. I, as a Black Lives Matter activist, believe this, right? And so the point of the pages, what they're doing is they're really instilling pride in that group. We are descendants of Confederates. This is not about racism. This is about our pride and our Confederate heritage, right? So most of the narratives, even for the groups that many Americans would see as like highly polarizing, was reinforcing that kind of in-group pride. And then when you do that, there's a kind of a presentation of other groups as the other, right? So the question then becomes, if I, a real American, have this identity and this other guy's identity feels kind of counter to mine, the question that kind of is sort of underpinning a lot of it is like, who is America for? So if you believe in kind of like there's a finite set of resources, why are we giving money to refugees when we should be supporting our veterans? And that was a theme that was like hammered home constantly. Why should Black Americans vote if this country has never done anything for them, right?
Hmm.
And so, or for us, is how it's phrased. It's always phrased as like, I am a member of this community, speaking to people who are just like me. And so it doesn't read as like media from on high or, um, kind of like ivory tower intellectuals or media pundits talking to you. It reads like you're having a conversation with people who are just like you. And so there's that element of you're receptive to the message because it's coming from somebody who is theoretically just like you. And then the
Right.
other thing,
But
oh,
unless
go
you're
ahead.
like a Russian 20 something, 30 something that lives outside of Moscow, they're not really just like you. They're
They're
just
not really
pretending to
just like
be.
you.
Right.
So
Why
there's
the
this
focus on the black community specifically, or was that just an example you picked?
No, 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 that was the actually a huge percentage of the content was focused on the Black community. We were just, so the Senate requested from the social media platforms, from Facebook, Twitter, and Alphabet, Google, which included YouTube, that they provide all of the data related to this operation. And then I led one of the teams that analyzed that data set. And there was another team that did the same analysis with the same data. We were told not to communicate because they wanted to make sure that they could check, make sure that different teams found the same things because this was such a political live wire at the time. This was 2018 that we were doing this work. It was before the Mueller report came out. And so what we got when we were given this data set was this look about 400 gigs worth of stuff, several hundred thousand memes, 10.5 million tweets. So just this kind of corpus spanning multiple years of their activity. And then what we were tasked with was saying, what are the kind of tactics, techniques, and procedures that this particular adversary used what were they doing? What was the goal? What were the messages? How did it work? And you couldn't look at it and not see the extraordinary effort put into expanding racial tension, and particularly by targeting the Black community.
When you say memes, I think a lot of people know what those are, but when I think meme, I think Kermit the Frog sipping tea. I think somebody rickrolling me when I'm clicking on a link, right? Those are what I'm thinking of. Are we talking about the same thing?
Yeah, so meme, like the kind of geeky academic definition goes back to Richard Dawkins, right? The idea of a cultural gene, a unit of culture. And much the way your genes kind of in aggregate form you as a person, memes and this kind of building block, in aggregate kind of comprises culture, right? A particular type of culture. So a meme is something that is intended to be spread, it's intended to propagate. It's not only the kind of square cat picture with the white words on it, which is I think what
Okay.
has come to be thought of. It's also catchphrases. It's things that sort of signal a participation in a particular community. If I were to say this is fine, probably maybe 50% of your audience would immediately see the dog on fire room, right?
Right.
If I were to say winter is coming, maybe you get more people, right?
Yeah, this is your brain
There,
on drugs. Is that one? That's something I
right,
remember
right,
from the 80s.
exactly.
Yeah, so basically anything I remember from the 80s or 90s is potentially a meme because everything else is gone. That's how
It's
effective
intended
these
to be
things are.
sticky. Yeah, well, they're intended to be sticky. They're intended to, people will use them in a certain way. If you were to go and look at like the K-pop community on Twitter, I am not a K-pop fan. I'm not a not fan. I just don't
Not
pay much
yet.
attention to
Yeah.
it. But there are all these, there are these like hashtags. There's like a whole vocabulary, right? There's like a little like kind of like in-group language of ways in which people who are part of the community talk to each other. And so there's one of the things that's really unique about the internet is ways in which searching for certain hashtags, certain phrases, certain words kind of like is the gateway to finding that entire faction, that entire
Right.
community. And
Hashtag
so,
BTS, right?
right, no, BTS is definitely
Their new
it's
track
gone
is
down that
fire.
rabbit hole. Yeah. But what the Internet Research Agency did, if you look at their Instagram posts, every single Instagram post has like 40 hashtags down at the bottom because they know that that's how people are going to find them. So if you're searching for, in the most basic form, hashtag MAGA, right? Was
Hmm.
the, one thing that the Trump campaign did very well was their slogan became, a really kind of, it could be reduced down to an acronym, and that acronym became kind of a meme. People, and it became a thing that people would use to signal their support by putting the hashtag in their Twitter bio, by putting the hashtag on Instagram. So you make your community discoverable in that way. And the other thing that's really interesting about memes, they don't require very much thought usually, right? It's something that kind of immediately hits. It's got some emotional resonance. It's funny. It's pithy. It's tailored for kind of internet style communication. The olden days of propaganda, a lot of times it was like kind of long form narratives. You would read a persuasive article or an article that made an insinuation. You would feel a certain way, maybe, but it required a lot more time. With the mimetic propaganda, with just I believe that veterans before refugees, like and share if you agree. That's all you have to say, right? And you've communicated information about yourself, information about what you believe, a political point of view, like and share. That takes 2 seconds. That there's no real heavy lift. You're not asking someone to go read 1,000-word article. They click a button and it's moved on to their network as well. And so that's the kind of propagation that happens.
So it's like virtue signal plus propaganda in a easily snackable, shareable piece of content.
Yeah, and to be part of the community, to be part of the activist faction, all you do is click the share button.
And are these things being created by bots or real people or both? Because I'm always on the fence, right? I do a lot of stuff about the Chinese Communist Party and like organ trafficking or whatever. And you see the Wu Mao, the 50 Cent Army, they'll post, and some of it is clearly just like an automated thing because they've done zero looking into anything that I've done. Or I'll get DMs when I do stuff about Russia. Like I had Clint Watts on the show, and he was like, "Watch out, you're going to get a ton of Russian bots and Russian hate mail." And I was like, no problem. And my DMs were just alive with people who are like, "You should have been an abortion," like stuff like that, like horrible things. And I was like, "Oh, this is just automated. I bet this person tweets it to everybody who is on their like hate list." But then other things look like real people. Other things like
Yeah.
someone will engage, and some of them seem to just be really sort of dumb folks from wherever, but other times it's clearly a foreigner because they're like, what is it called? Like subject verb agreement is off and everything. Like the
Yeah.
punctuation
The
is
articles
off.
are wrong. Like
Yeah,
the
the
yeah.
articles are wrong. Pronouns are wrong. Stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, so you raise an interesting thing there. So I'm at Stanford Internet Observatory now, and I look at both China and Russia, and we've actually done quite a lot of work on China recently, because one of the really interesting things, well, the Internet Research Agency, um, they are still, I believe Russia is still kind of um, most effective, most sophisticated at understanding how to target Americans. And that's in part because you asked earlier why racism, that was a very common theme in the Cold War also, right? Even how can you say you're a free society if Black people are treated so badly and don't have rights, right? In the sort of civil rights era. So they have a very kind of deep bench to work with on understanding how to what messaging works with Americans. As we've seen China come into the game, as we've seen China expand from the Wumao, which focus on the domestic Chinese internet, into how do you execute those operations targeting people internationally? And that's a really interesting question. So, what we've seen from China, first of all, propaganda is a core part of Chinese government public diplomacy, right? So, there is a propaganda bureau. This is not a thing that is done surreptitiously or secretly. It's quite out there. So they have a large state media apparatus, quite well developed. That's attributable. So that's what it's sometimes called white propaganda. It's the attribution is quite clear, as opposed to what Russia was doing, which is sometimes called black propaganda, because the attribution is nebulous. It's kind of opaque. It's hidden in the shadows. It's actively misattributed, as opposed to knowing, where the provenance comes from. So what we've seen from China is, first of all, they've taken their broadcast apparatus, their television stations, their radio stations, their print news, and they've begun to establish presences for all of those other publications on social platforms as well. So they have hundreds of millions, not an exaggeration. I think CGTN, China Global TV Network, has over 100 million Facebook fans on its page. It's, I think, one of the
Wow.
largest. Yeah, I mean, to put that in perspective, I think CNN has about 33 million, right? So this is, sort of like 3x CNN. Russia Today has something like between 7 and 15, depending. They all have regionalization for their channels. So what you see is the overt apparatus ported to Facebook, even though Chinese citizens are banned from Facebook. They can't go on Facebook. The purpose is not to reach the domestics the way you have with some of the Chinese state media and the Wumao. It's to create ways of reaching audiences globally. And so they run ads. And so you'll see CGTN boosting their content, for example, about coronavirus. They began to run ads kind of in earnest, pushing out the Chinese state position on coronavirus, where it had originated, how the country was handling it, all of the kind of glowing stories about, well, China sent PPE to Italy. Here's China built this hospital. So these sorts of positive stories. So they're using the Facebook apparatus as yet one more channel in an overt propaganda strategy. Then the other thing that they do is they begin to run bots. And that's where you get into, again, that actively misattributed. These are just ordinary people on the street talking. But again, they are controlled by, the attribution is made to the Chinese Communist Party. It's a little bit difficult to make an attribution to like where in the Chinese government this is attributed to.
Hmm.
So Facebook and Twitter say kind of China or CCP. Um, but what we see from those accounts is, as you're describing, it's very much like the Wumao kind of ported to this other platform. It's not very well targeted. The personas are not very sophisticated. It's not like Russia, where they had these personas that were so convincing that real people, real big influencers, Donald Trump Jr., Dinesh D'Souza, Jack Dorsey, were retweeting these accounts because they really seemed to be a Black woman activist, a Marlboro Man style, like, kind of Trump supporter, right? And so, where Russia invested years in developing these personas and making them convincing, what you see from China is this kind of throw spaghetti at the wall. The
Right.
accounts don't even have plausible names. They rarely have a profile picture. They don't have a great bio. It's just crap.
Yeah, it's like an anime or like a stock photo and it's cropped poorly. Yeah, it's almost like that even the creation of the photo was automated using like basic AI and it just didn't work very well. It's like a screenshot from a photo of something else. Like it just you're right. And the name is like Huggy Bear Rose and you're like that's not a real name. It's a bunch of random words that sounded cute put together that somebody who didn't speak English fluently thought sounded like a name.
So I think that you see that you're absolutely right. You see this. They're not very persuasive, but one thing that we're looking at right now is trying to understand the motivation for that. Like, why would you run an operation that's just such garbage? Like, what is the point? Because when you when you go and you try to take over a hashtag or put out a hashtag or do something like this, Twitter is watching now, right? There are integrity teams that are designed to find state-sponsored operations on the platform. This is the kind of legacy, the improvement post 2016. So the question is like, why do you do it? And one of the things that we're thinking about at the observatory is not all propaganda is designed to persuade. Not all activity is designed to persuade. Sometimes it's designed to distract. Sometimes it's
Hmm.
designed to just make it too hard to find the good stuff. So, if in the case of like the Hong Kong protest, there was this one moment, and I remember this, I was sitting in an airport, I was waiting to go somewhere, and I was on Twitter. And this was right when the Hong Kong police had shot a woman in the eye. I believe she was a medic or a nurse or something. They shot her in the eye, and there were these extraordinary photos, and of the woman on the ground, the tear gas all around. It was very, very compelling visuals. Um, and Western Twitter was paying attention all of a sudden, right? It was really paying attention to this moment. My Twitter feed, which is not primarily China watchers, was all talking about this moment. And it reminded me of Iran, actually, when during the Arab, kind of right after the Arab Spring, there was a woman, I think her name was Niha, who was murdered, and her face became an icon, right? And similarly with China, this woman who was shot became an icon. And the protesters began coming out in solidarity with eye patches and things covering their eyes, sort of, for their this sort of woman who became an icon. And when you have that moment where the protest has a human face, has an icon, right? That's where you see the government oftentimes will come in and will realize that this is now a thing that it has to respond to. This has
Hmm.
just gotten quite big. Right now, there's a face, there's a humanization. It's not abstract protest, it's quite personalized. And so, what we started to see almost immediately after that incident happened was all of these accounts coming out of the woodwork to talk about how the West had it wrong. Her own side had shot her. She was really a plant. This was a false flag. The Hong Kong police hadn't done it. So ways in which when that happens, you see this barrage of conflicting narratives. They don't even have to make sense. They don't have to be cohesive. They just have to be in the hashtag, and they have to be so that when people are searching for information about this protester or about this moment, what they see is this content, which is designed to cast doubt on what actually happened by flooding the zone with alternative explanations. You saw Russia do this
Right.
when Malaysia Airlines, when the flight came down, also, 6 or 7 different explanations for what had happened, but how it wasn't them. When Jamal Khashoggi was killed, the Saudi bots turned on. Boom, here are all the different reasons why Jamal Khashoggi was not murdered, was just missing, was still in the embassy, had fled,
Right. So this is
who
a
can
journalist
know?
that was murdered in the Saudi consulate or embassy and just they cut him into little pieces and they got rid of it. It's horrifying. So what they're doing is they're competing for attention, right? So and they realize, I guess, that they don't need to get a critical mass of all Americans to do anything. They can just focus on these pockets. Diseases can take root literally or figuratively. Swing states can be swung, right? And you focus on these little bubbles, just like in real life, that make fringe perspectives seem like a normal or prevailing one. So you have like anti-vax, 9/11 truthers, birthers, Pizzagate, flat earth. And in this case, like you say, you flood the zone with something that people just go, well, we can never be sure what the real answer is because these guys over here are saying that MH17, this Malaysian Airlines flight crashed. They're saying it was shot down by Ukraine. They're saying it was shot down by Russia. These people are saying it was shot down by the US. These other people say it was a mechanical thing. We just don't know. Even though it's like 99% of all the evidence points to one thing, if enough people scream that it's not that and that it's something else, and then it casts doubt on what the real explanation might be, and it doesn't even matter. So what's interesting is a lot of people, and I originally thought this too, they're just going to argue their perspective. Hey, this was shot down by Russian militants in Ukraine. No, it wasn't. It was shot down by this, or it was mechanical failure. But if they say like 10 different things, it's even more effective than just persuasively arguing their one counter argument. If you just cast doubt, you don't even have to persuade people, right? It's easier to just create FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Yep. And so I think one of the things when we see the Chinese activity, it may not be designed to be persuasive, right? And they
Right.
may not care if they lose those accounts because it's really easy to spin up another cluster of accounts when you need them, or to go buy a cluster of accounts off the black market if you need to.
Hmm.
And so there's a difference in strategy. You know, Russia ran this multi-year long game, and it takes a lot of time and investment in those personas in that operation. And then, of course, when they were discovered and they lost those, they lost about 3,800 Twitter accounts and a little over kind of 200 in aggregate Facebook and Instagram pages. When you lose that audience, you have to decide whether you're going to go reinvest in growing it again over, again, a multi year period. One of the things that we're seeing is the idea that maybe, particularly for American politics, you have enough people who already have that point of view. You can just go in and amplify it. Why
Yeah.
create your own accounts? So, one of the things that we're looking for the 2020 election is not so much that same, replicating the tactics of 2016 or replicating this multi-year long game propaganda operation or this influence operation, but perhaps instead taking those highly polarized existing factions that exist from real Americans and just amplifying the contents that you create that what could possibly have happened in this moment on this night. Well, here's 10 different real Americans who have 10 different points of view about that. We're just going to amplify those, those different perspectives. And that's something that we've been seeing, we've been seeing the state media take that route, right? RT speaks very differently
Russia
about
Today, or is it just
Russia.
RT now? Did they get rid
Well,
of the
it
full name?
was Russia Today, but now the proper name is RT.
Okay.
RT speaks very differently about the Floyd protests, for example, than its subsidiary Redfish does. Right, Redfish really leans into the American left, amplifying content from the kind of like the left leaning communities. RT takes the more law and order approach, articulating the conservative point of view. And so here, even in a completely attributed way, if you're looking at Russian state media narratives. On one side, they're talking about how America is burning. On the other side, they're talking about how cops are destroying communities. And so these are both points of view held by real Americans. So they're just kind of putting it out there, and then they're using their broadcast tools and their ability to reach people to kind of put out these kind of conflicting, the sort of opposite sides of the story, and then retweeting and finding prominent accounts that hold these particular points of view and amplifying them and trying to get those ideas more exposure.
Have there been leaks from the IRA? Like, have we heard from people that have worked there that are like, yep, this is totally real? Because other people are like, oh, it's not even a thing. That's just an excuse that we're being told. Of course, it's just more FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But have we heard from anybody that's worked there that's like, no, my job was to
Yeah.
cause crap on Twitter?
Yes. Actually, Russian press did some of the early high quality kind of
Huh.
exposés. There's a
Didn't see that coming.
yeah, no. So there was actually a woman who went undercover. Her name is Ludmila Savchuk, and I probably just butchered the pronunciation of that, but she she went and worked as an IRA troll, and then kind of came out and told stories about it. And a few others have also told stories about their time there. They had these people who've come out who've given, who worked in the troll factory and then told their stories. And they described something that sounds very much like a social media marketing agency, right? We have quotas. We had stand up. During stand up, these were the kinds of guidance that we were given for what kind of posts we should put out. The Twitter people operated a little bit differently than the Instagram people. They had to understand the nuances of the platform and react to what was kind of dominant and trending on the platform that day. They talk about sitting next to the person, I'm running the Black Lives Matter page and they're running the Confederacy page, and sort of, how are they going to do things that would kind of start fights and increase tension? So the troll next to you is tasked with targeting the other community. Um, One thing that I think is very different about the IRA that gets lost sometimes in the conversation about the memes, though, is that the IRA actively engaged with real activists also. So one of the things that we talk about when we think about like Cold War active measures is the idea of agents of influence, right? People who work for another government that are not telling you who they work for, but trying to influence you to take a particular action.
Right. Like that show, The Americans, right?
Yes, The
Remember the
Americans is a
you ever
yes.
watch that? I love
I
that
love that
show.
show. I loved it.
Yeah, of course you do. Yeah, that makes sense. And they had like the South African people who were like anti-apartheid or something like that, but they were just being used by the Russian government to stir stuff. And they were just like college students, and one of them ended up, I think, spoiler alert if you haven't seen the whole series, they end up like killing him for some reason, or he ends up like getting left behind in some operation. So it's like
Yeah.
they're using these Americans and people who mean well just as tools to further their own ends. It has nothing to do with the actual mission.
Right, and so they find people who are ideologically aligned with what they're pretending to be, and social media makes this easy, right? You don't have to have a sophisticated, handsome spy and alias the way Philip Jennings is the character in that show.
Hmm.
You can just be you're an avatar on a Facebook profile, right? And but at the same time, you're the admin of this page that I follow, and I'm a Black Lives Matter activist, and you look like you're the person running a Black Lives Matter page, and then you DM me, and we start having a conversation. You say, hey, can I give you some resources for a protest? Do you guys need some money? We can't be there in person because we live too far away, but would some posters help? Right. And so you start to see this process by which there's extensive amounts of direct messaging that's happening, right? They're really communicating with the activists. They're working to, useful idiot is the kind of like, unflattering term, but to create people who are unwittingly doing what they want them to do because of this perception of shared camaraderie. And so, and they do that they do that targeting a range of communities. They hire a Hillary Clinton impersonator. They pay for a Hillary Clinton impersonator to show up to a Trump rally sitting on a flatbed truck, like in jail.
Cute.
They hire a self-defense teacher to teach the Black community ostensibly how to defend themselves at protests, right? So again, these are these things that were there, and they're actually paying the guy, and they're paying him via PayPal. They're communicating with him via telephone and text.
And he doesn't know that this is all just an influence operation. He's just like, great, a gig that I can
Yeah,
run.
okay, yeah. Most
Amazing.
people don't think that the person who reaches out to them on Facebook is a Russian troll. That's not
Generally
where
not.
people's minds go, right?
No, ironically, most
um,
of the people that probably believe in a lot of these conspiracy theories would be the people that would be suspicious enough to believe that. Except in this case, since the crazies agree with the trolls, they really won't know because they think they're all on the same side. And that's probably how, I'm sure you heard about this. There's like a Texas secession movement and like a
yeah.
pro-Muslim protest. Can you
Yep.
take us through that? I don't remember the exact details, but this was like a classic, ridiculous example of what happens.
Yeah, so they had a page called United Muslims, and they had another page called Heart of Texas. Heart of Texas was the Texas secessionist page. United Muslims was the pro-Muslim page, which they used in some very interesting ways. They used it when they wanted to. They ran like a Muslims for Hillary protest where they wanted people to show up and be proud Muslims for Hillary, which of course was designed to antagonize the other side. So sort of a very kind of kind of dirty way to use that group. But what they did in this particular case is there was an Islamic center in I think Houston, Texas. I think Dawa Islamic Center, if I recall the name. And what they did was they had the Heart of Texas page come out to protest the Islamicization of Texas, was what the Facebook event was called. And then the United Muslims were called to rally on the same day to defend. I'm trying to remember what they said. The specific wording. It was kind of to kind of put out a kind of pro-Muslim presence to counter this anti-Muslim rally. And so people sitting in St. Petersburg created two Facebook events and solicited the members of this group, which were, I think, both were over 100,000 members. These were not
Oh,
small.
wow.
These are not small pages. No. So they had these different pages, and they put out these events, and then people RSVP'd, and then they showed up in person. And so you had two different groups on opposite sides of the street at the same time. And of course, the organizers aren't there. They're
Yeah,
in Russia,
they
right?
live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, right? The organize. I wonder, have they ever done anything where there's a protest and like seven people go like, "Hey, where's the guy that set this whole thing up? Like, no one's here," or like, "Hey, the other side didn't show up."
What they kept doing, and what you see constantly over and over and over again in the memes, is they're trying to recruit people to be their local on the ground representative.
Ah,
So, like,
okay.
hey, will you photograph, get involved in the cause, come photograph our protests, come be a reporter for our fake newspaper. So they're constantly trying to find real Americans so that they do have someone to send in person to these events. So that's, of course, that is part of the operation. What winds up happening with this Islamic Center rally is the police have to come and kind of like keep the peace between the two sides. And then if you go on YouTube, I actually went to YouTube because I was curious if there was first person video footage. Houston Chronicle covered this. Major Texas press is out there reporting on this protest, and you can go back and actually read the coverage from the day, which I think now has a disclaimer up at the top linking to their more recent coverage talking about how this was executed by Russia. But you have this YouTube footage. You actually can go and see man on the street, woman with a camera phone recording this stuff. So it actually
Wow.
happened, and and it was, and people uploaded the footage of it to YouTube, which then of course provides the trolls with more fodder because now they have video.
Right, and of course, this has other This has other real world impacts in the UK. I don't know if this has happened here, but people are burning down 5G towers because they're like, this causes coronavirus. The 5G tower, so they're destroying and burning these things down. And then, of course, the probably the most common, easy to point to example of disinformation in the USA costing people's lives is a lot of the anti-mask stuff is normal Americans, but a lot of it is definitely foreign interference. I mean, you can just sort of tell has all the hallmarks of it. Have you looked at that at all? It seems like that's an easy one for them to get involved with.
We have a hard time. So one thing I'll say, we have a really hard time with attribution.
Hmm.
And the Internet Research Agency, when the platforms provided the data to the Senate, the platforms did the attribution. So I used to get like shit from people on the internet, like, well, she said it was a Russian troll, but how does she know? No, the platforms did digital forensics, looked at things like metadata, logins, shared email addresses, cookies, certain types of behavior, did this attribution, kind of trace the network. And one thing that we found when we looked at the data related to how that the attribution methodology, Twitter provided some of the metadata. They were registered, the Baltimore City News fake Twitter account was registered to a Russian Beeline phone, right? You had American pages that were being run with, people logging in from Jakarta. And so there was not very much of an effort to conceal the operation because nobody was looking. They paid for the ads in rubles. So this was not
Really?
yeah, yes.
Oh, wow. Wow. That wasn't, they're like, I'm not even going to try and cover this.
No, it was just right out there, Beeline is a Russian carrier, so we're looking at all device data and we're like, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, like, oh, my VPN's not working. Don't even turn it on. No one's even looking. Don't even worry about it.
Basically. But that's changed now, right? So anytime you any kind of cybersecurity or kind of conflict situation, when you expose the tactic of the adversary should evolve to no longer use that tactic, right? And so what we have now is an interesting challenge where there are integrity teams looking, there are researchers looking, regular people are cognizant of the fact that Russian bots or Chinese bots or Saudi bots, all any nation's bots exist on Twitter. And so what you have instead is it's much more difficult to say this is being amplified by the Russians. And one of the reasons why we try to hold off from doing that is one, you don't want to delegitimize existing movements. And that's partly not to delegitimize them, but it's also partly not to absolve them of their responsibility. If it is
Hmm.
kind of domestic actors that are pushing out lies or misleading video footage or whatever else. So with the coronavirus, one of the things that we look at some of the work we've done on it at Stanford is we've looked at how different countries all around the world. We've looked at Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, Brazil. Um, how each of these governments has responded to coronavirus, both domestically and internationally, ways that they've used their state media apparatus, and then the ones that have gone one step further and used this kind of covert, Twitter bots, fake accounts, fake news, that sort of more darker side of the propaganda spectrum. And what we see is the there's messaging that's put out for a domestic audience, and there's messaging that's put out for an international audience. And the international content is often designed to, it's just kind of like a public diplomacy effort. We want to look good, so here we are talking about what we've done. But what really matters is, particularly for more authoritarian regimes that didn't handle it so well, ensuring that their population believes that they handled it well to
Right.
preserve their ability to govern, right? And so what you see is conspiracy theories that the state puts out to ensure that, in large part for the domestic audience, because they want the domestic audience to believe this was a matter outside of our control. Dark forces beyond our borders brought this virus here, and this is what we have done to control it. But really, the coronavirus was created by the Americans in a lab at Fort Detrick, was kind of
Right.
where, some of these sorts of things went. And then you have entities like Russia Today, which say like the Iranians are saying that the Americans. So it's this kind of daisy chain of just asking questions, and it's been really fascinating to watch. The thing with coronavirus is the entire world is paying attention to it. Every government has had to, handle the crisis in its own way. The entirety of the population of the planet pretty much has all been searching for information about the same thing as various countries have gone through phases of high death rates or lockdowns. So it's really been a remarkable opportunity to study how narratives move and how this interplay between the kind of traditional, like sort of fever swamps of the internet being legitimized through state media and state influencers in this kind of free for all. So in some ways, it's been less of a are Russian trolls in there and more of a in this sort of free for all in which every faction is participating simultaneously, what are the narratives that are spreading? What are the mechanisms by which they move through communities? And then what is the impact that they have? Do we start to see people change their behavior in response to allegations of a drug working or not working, allegations of masks working or not working? How does that become, incorporated into people's identities, their partisan identity in particular in the US? And that's the kind of stuff we've been looking at.
Do we know if the United States is doing this as well to other countries? Like, are we doing this in, gosh, I don't even know, like Central Asia, South America? It seems like we would have done, but I don't know. Are we doing mostly like, hey, we're trying to foment democracy and we're promoting democracy? Or is it kind of like, you know what, screw it, we're doing the exact same thing?
We have not found an operation attributable to the United States. So as when we were chatting earlier, and I said there are certain laws that prevent the United States from putting out particular types of propaganda or communications even on social platforms because of the uh, risk of it being seen by American persons and then violating certain laws. Similarly, doing kind of mass ingestion of social media data to do analysis and find influencers or messaging. That's also not, that's not legal. Like there's certain privacy laws that prevent the US government from doing that. So in some ways, these sort of laws that were put in place for kind of older communication ecosystems have limited, is the sense that I've gotten, US government's ability to do this. So even though everybody says, you're not talking about what the US is
Right.
doing, we don't have any activity attributed to the US. And that is not because people are afraid to find it or unwilling to look for it. It's just that's the kind of current state right now. So the platform integrity teams have been pretty clear that they will take down any content that they see as inauthentic, and that's it's kind of where we are right now. The assumption being that domestic groups do come down periodically. Um,
Hmm.
Activist groups occasionally come down. There's a variety of reasons. Sometimes the platforms will pull things down because of coordinated and authentic behavior is the term. That really usually means that there's like a state actor involved. And so the platforms will then, Twitter will make the data set public. Facebook will write a blog post, and outside researchers will do an analysis and publicize their findings. We do that sometimes. We're one of the teams that does those analyses. Um, but the, yeah, I mean, the other way that things the other way that things come down is like for spam, just kind of coordinated distribution, like no allegations that any foreign actor or domestic actor or government, sorry, that no foreign actor or government is involved. But just like I have a blog and then I have 10 other blogs whose job it is to promote that one blog. And so it becomes more of like a spam type takedown.
Yeah, that makes sense. The coordinated inauthentic behavior has got to be tough to catch. That's a whole technological discussion. I wonder what other solutions are available to us for this, because especially in this, like, I think Sam Harris calls it an epistemo. I'm going to try and say it. I had it the other day. Uh, Epistemological free for all, where facts do not exist. And I've always wanted to use the word epistemological because it sounds hella sophisticated. But what solutions are available to us for this if people kind of don't believe any facts now, or if that's like the
Yeah.
idea that they're trying to generate, or the mindset they're trying to generate?
I think that we have to fundamentally rethink curation and recommendations online. And I think that that is a bigger issue than state actors or not state actors. I think that's a question of information integrity. And I think that's a question of, this is where, people will yell on the internet and say, like, who decides? Well, somebody's already deciding. The algorithm is already structured in a certain way. So I don't understand why we've decided that these algorithms that are like 10 years old are sacrosanct and we can't rethink it in any way. So I do believe, and as you started to see with anti-vaccine content in particular, with QAnon now as well, the platforms are saying we're going to remove it from their recommendation engine. It stays up on the platform, meaning if you want to go find it, you can go find it. But we're not going to return it in search results. We're not going to return it. We're not going to promote it in the recommendation engine. And if somebody is looking for an answer to a topic, we're not going to serve up garbage in response to that inquiry. And it's weird to me that in the, span of like 5 short years or so, we've gotten, this idea that, we, who can possibly decide how to set the rankings and weightings? There is a system that's in place that's only that old. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that we could change it. Um, Google in particular recognized pretty early on that serving garbage in response to health and financial inquiries for search results had potentially very serious negative downstream impacts for people's lives. And so it came up with a framework called Your Money or Your Life. This was back in, I think, 2013 that the framework was introduced. 2015 it was improved. It didn't apply to YouTube at the time, interestingly, because for a long time, the search function was seen as kind of different than the social function in the sense that when you're
Mm,
going to search, you have a question. If you have cancer, you want to know what's going to happen to you. You want reliable medical information, not juice fast bullshit.
yeah.
But if you're on YouTube, you maybe want to be entertained, right? And so the idea of, none of these platforms not the social platforms, they were not developed to be information libraries and repositories of human knowledge where people go find answers to their financial and health and political questions on those platforms. They were to help you like find your friends, right? And find
Right.
your knitting club, not your
Yeah.
not your scientific and medical authority for how you're going to treat a disease or, operate in the world of a global pandemic, right? And as they've been put into that position, as this is what they have inadvertently evolved into, I think it's eminently reasonable to say we have to be rethinking what we're curating and what we're recommending in the context of looking at the potential downstream harms. On the subject of the foreign actors, though,
Hmm.
that's something where, for the 2020 election, we've really done a whole lot of work. Outside researchers like, our team at Stanford or um, governments, tech companies, the integrity teams at tech companies, policy teams, civil society, which, particularly for like the African American community that's been very targeted. They have a real strong voice now saying, like, hey, come on, these fake trolls pretending to be Black people are really detrimental to our community. What are you doing
Hmm.
about them? the ways in which academic researchers, all of the different kind of stakeholders that pay attention to and study this topic, now are working together in concert, saying, okay, the 2020 election is coming up. How do we have a narrowly tailored, nobody wants to be the fact checking police, but how do we have a narrowly tailored kind of multi stakeholder ability to say, here's voter suppression narratives, here's voting misinformation related to voting itself. And how do we try to ensure integrity in the election, ensure integrity in the outcome of the election, make sure that people's degree of trust in the outcome of the election remains high, the election remains legitimate. How do we all take the tools and capabilities that we have and work together? So if we see something that looks like anomalous activity, we're not going to be the ones to make the determination about whether it's Russian, Chinese, or domestics. But if we were to give it to the social platform and say, hey, you guys should take a look at this hashtag, you should take a look at this page, take a look at this account, they're the ones who then have the capability to make that judgment behind the scenes. Or similarly, when someone like the FBI says, this site appears to have financial ties to Russian activities, Russian intelligence services,
Right.
that
They're
goes
buying
to the
ads in rubles. Yeah.
right. So this is where you start to see that all of the different, we all have different capabilities. How do we ensure that that we're sharing information in an effective way, uh, particularly as the 2020 election approaches?
If we can sow doubt and be negative with these narratives, can we do positive things with it as well? Like, I'm kind of thinking of explosives, right? They can be used for construction, but only like a small part of that would be construction. You can blast the rocks and then you can build the tunnel, and that part takes a really long time. But then when it comes to destruction, they're really fast. You don't worry about cleaning up the mess if you blow up like a shopping mall or something, right? You just worry about the destruction part. Can we also do positive things with these techniques and these narratives, or these narrative building techniques and technologies? It seems like there should be a way for us to go, hey, remember when everybody started to believe that COVID-19 was caused by 5G? Why don't we use that to show people that, oh gosh, I don't know, good hygiene, or like staying in school is a good thing? Is anybody thinking about that? Or is it just like, hey man, one problem at a time?
No, people are thinking about that. On the immunization front in particular, you are seeing a number of medical journals, running convenings of, kind of immunization research teams working alongside marketing teams, not because they're interested in the marketing piece, but again, this idea of everything is a marketing campaign for an idea now. So how do you ensure that you are communicating in a way that's conducive to the modern environment? This is one of the things that's been very frustrating to me as the kind of COVID stuff began happening in January, we started seeing the anti-vaccine narrative. So we were paying attention to coronavirus pretty early on because we pay attention to internet conversations globally, and this was a big topic of conversation in Southeast Asia, even in January. And what we started to see among Americans was the anti-vaccine activists saying, "Oh my God, they're going to use this as a way to institute programs of mandatory vaccinations." Right? And so that was the sort of thing where we're like, okay, this is a thing that if there is a vaccine, like the people who are the government and the manufacturers and the scientists and the public health authorities have to do better than a press conference here and there and like a
Hmm.
PDF and the because the problem that you're getting at is that there are low levels of trust in authority and there's low levels of trust between communities, and that is not a social media problem, that is a societal problem. And social media can exacerbate it, social media can reflect it, but ultimately the question becomes, how do Americans respond to their authority figures, and do they trust them? And if this the president that we have, interestingly, funny enough, he was kind of a darling of the anti-vaccine movement when he was running in 2016. He was talking about how he's tweeted in the past, kind of tacit support for the idea that vaccines cause autism and a range of these other kind of theories. So they were big supporters of the president then. Now, as this Operation Warp Speed and this idea that the U.S. government is looking for and hoping to find a coronavirus vaccine, they're not quite sure what to make of that, actually. So, but interestingly, the people who opposed the president, who do generally trust science, don't trust the president. And so you have this interesting dynamic of, would you take a vaccine that Donald Trump's FDA says is safe? And that's one of the narratives that you see even from people who are inclined to trust scientists and science in general, believe in vaccination, vaccinate their children, are hesitant because they don't trust this particular administration and this
Right.
particular administration's commitment to science. So the thing that's interesting about social media is it really kind of tears down the veneer of infallibility, right? You see your leaders having,
Right.
you know, it, trying to think of
Yeah.
like a nice way to say it.
There there might not be, so just go for it.
But it's the idea that like, you come away with the sense that like nobody's steering the ship, right? Nobody's in charge.
Right.
And the other thing is, you see the media get things wrong a lot. There were a lot of stories early on with COVID-19 about, oh, it's just the bad flu, right? It's no big deal.
Right.
Um, there are a lot of people who were very angry about that. Then there was the mask guidance issue. CDC and World Health Organization didn't update their guidance until people on social media who were not even epidemiologists had been screaming for weeks that we needed to be using masks. And then there was a sense of, well, random person on Twitter seems to be right and the authorities are lying to us or wrong. So how can
Yeah.
we trust the authorities when they come to us later? So you just have this sense that I think we have to rethink how authorities communicate in the era of social media. I think people have to, and that goes for kind of media as well, in the sense of saying, hey, look, we got this wrong. We didn't have the, or not even we got it wrong. With the information at the time, this seemed accurate. New information has since come out that renders that obsolete or incorrect. And here is where we are today. Right. And or communicating to people, we are 25% sure of this now, and here's our best guess, 25%. You guys are all on here looking for information. We're going to level with you. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. Here's how we should be thinking about this, right? And it requires a very different style of communication than I think these institutional authorities are used to. Um, and I think that ultimately is going to have to change in order to restore trust in,
Yeah.
you know, in authority and media.
Almost like thinking in bets, right? Have you ever read that book or heard of
Yeah,
that book? Yeah. And
yeah. I was
instead
a,
of
I was a
saying,
trader for a while. Yeah.
oh, yeah, so yeah, thinking in bets, right? Like
Right.
we're not 100% sure. And we can admit that because I get why an agency says you have to do it this way because this is what we know right now. Because if they say, well, we're really not sure, a lot of people are going to go, well, I'm going to go with the guy who says that he's sure, even though he just pulled the information completely out of the air and has no facts to back it up or research. It just sounds more persuasive. But the problem is once you have to change your mind, then people go, well, how do I know this isn't one of your things where you're just going to flip flop on me? But if you say, look, we're 60% sure it's this way, and if we do it this way, it's at least safer than doing it the other way until we know for sure. A lot of people are just going to be, a lot of folks like us are going to go, okay, good enough. That sounds like a plan. But I think there's just going to be a lot of people that are used to hearing certainty and only will settle for that. And that's
Yeah.
a problem. Social media manipulation is right now. What happens now that deepfakes are coming? They're going to be
Yeah.
super easy to make. Deepfakes, for people that don't know, is when like, I mean, I can only think of porn examples, which might be a little incriminating, but whatever. It's like they put someone's face on a body of another person and they might even fake the voice and make it look real. I mean, how do we counteract that? If I see a video of Renee DiResta being like, hey, all this stuff I just said on the Jordan Harbinger Show and Joe Rogan about the IRA was just complete garbage. I just made it up. I was being paid by Canadian intelligence. I'm not likely, well, I am now after this, but normally I'm not likely to go, let me just double check that. I saw it in a video. It has to be real, right? Has to be real.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that lately. As a society, like we adapted to Photoshop, right? We adapted to CGI.
True.
There were these sorts of like, so I've been curious both about what is the impact of the technology, what is the societal acceptance and internalization of the technology. Um, Deepfakes are interesting because for those who don't know, with Photoshop, there's a thing that you can go back to, right? There is original material. And actually, funny enough, Adobe has actually been really like leading the vanguard of this desire to ensure that there is some sort of like cryptographically verified kind of um, certification that says that this is the image as it was when it came out of the camera and here it still is, or so you can see the manipulations that have taken place on an image or something. When you have something that's generated by AI, there is nothing to go back to. So the interesting question is, for audio or video, do people believe it? Right now, we're still in the uncanny valley. It's not quite right. It's not quite there, particularly video. There are certain detections, like ways that you can observe something that a computer has generated. There's little things like you can see when somebody's heartbeat is pulsing. The color of their skin changes ever so slightly. This is how your
Hmm.
iPhone can see if like red to normal, red to normal, red to normal. I feel like I
Wow,
should
I did
be.
not know that. That's incredible.
Yeah, there's ways that you can tell, if a if you're looking at a video of something that is alive. I'm not an expert in this particular type of detection, but um, what happens now though is we have the ability to generate text and still images and video and audio. And I think we focus a lot on the video because it's very, very sensational. As you mentioned, it also did kind of really take off in porn first.
Yeah, that's where most people
The
get their news these days, is right off Pornhub. Like new tech? Oh, let me go look it up right now.
porn started taking it down out of non-consent, actually, out of the idea that the people who were in it had not consented to be in the video.
Imagine looking to porn sites for like guidelines on how we're gonna
Yeah,
develop
on how
policy.
to develop policy for it. So that was kind of an interesting thing. Facebook and Twitter have since come down on generative media. They've recognized that it's different than something that's just selectively edited. Selectively edited is allowed to stay up, oftentimes with an annotation. Generated will come down if it's seen as being manipulative. Question is, what happens when you have generative that is labeled as satire?
Hmm.
Does it fall under artistic expression? So there's a lot of these kind of policy gray areas. But the thing with the video and audio is that usually, they're used to create sensational moments, right? So this is a hot mic politician or a sex tape politician has been, of course, because everything goes
Yeah.
back to that. Um, so those are very sensational moments that then inspire people to go and try to authenticate the video, find out who created it, find out how it spread. So there's a lot of attention that kind of immediately goes into understanding that particular video. The thing that's been more interesting to me has actually been like GPT-3, which is the OpenAI's text generation AI.
So this is like an AI algorithm or program that writes like a human. Is that kind of what that
Writes
is?
text. Yeah, you give it a
Okay.
prompt. You can give it kind of constraints around how creative it can be. The AI has been trained on content on the internet, so it's read Wikipedia, right? And so it has a body of knowledge, which is very interesting. And so, as I've been using it just to see what comes out of it, depending on what prompt you give it and how whether you constrain it to kind of stick to what it knows or allow it to be more creative, you will get content back, very different content. You can submit the same prompt over and over again, and it'll return very different types of content to you. You can have it write long form essays. You can give it tweets, and it'll return back kind of tweet length things. I've been working on an essay actually, and I thought, hey, I'm having a hard time with the closing. Well,
Yeah.
it's an article on AI. Let me give it a GPT-3 and see what the AI generates for me for my closing. Um, and it did a couple really interesting things. Like once or twice, it pulled in characters I had not mentioned. Yeah, I was writing about AI, and all of a sudden, it gave me a paragraph on Edward Snowden, and I thought, like,
Wow.
okay, wasn't expecting that. Once or twice, it returned links to like, returned regurgitations of academic papers that it had probably kind of, read at some point, consumed,
Right.
been trained on, and then a couple times it gave me back like once it suggested a title for the prompt. I gave it a couple paragraphs that suggested a title, and then it gave me, how when you go to like you read an article and it gives you the list of like related articles on the bottom.
Oh yeah.
So it like generated a whole bunch of titles for things that it thought would be like related to this content that I had given it, which I
Wow.
thought was sort of an interesting response to get back. But what the takeaway for me was like it's not perfect, it is sloppy, and at times it goes off the rails into these, like, the kind of, like, freshman philosophy essays, do you know what I
Yeah, I mean,
mean?
that's as far as I ever got with it, so it probably just looks like I wrote the essay, but yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
like
like,
these, like,
as Immanuel Kant
hand-wavy
once said, yeah,
or just, like, garbage, just, like, word soup where, like, you write enough words on a page and you hope that something has come out of it, but really it hasn't.
right. Yeah, you hope your teacher's grading it, like, while watching Netflix.
So, it's not perfect, but it's remarkably good, and it with like some mild human curation, you could see how if you wanted to run a Twitter bot, um, you could with some, give it a prompt, run it a bunch of times, pull the stuff that comes out of it, evaluate it, check it off and push it into a queue and then go, right? And it's original content. And that's the thing that's so remarkable about this stuff. You can't trace it back to something somebody else said. It's not a copy pasta. It's not an engram that is like, tied to some community or something in the past. It's uniquely generated content. And so it really is interesting. It kind of, in a way, democratizes the ability to run a commenter army because all of a sudden you have this machine that does the work of producing all the content that your, kind of, you know, 50 Cent army had previously been paid to do, right? So
Right.
you have this ability to create something that's virtually undetectable. It's cheap. It can be put into an environment where it's not sensational. People aren't going to go look at it. It's just read as like, this is the voice of the man on the street. This is the opinion of this commenter. And so what I think it ultimately does, a lot of these things, is they it means that we have to have a kind of a different relationship to our idea of identity online, right? When you can no longer trust that the content you're reading is being produced by a real person, when you can no longer distinguish, then the question becomes like, one is, do we care? Do we evaluate the comment based on the merits? But as we've talked about in this conversation, if you create the perception that a whole lot of people have this opinion and you've just done that, you don't even have to use copy pasta now. You have an AI generating that. Then you really do have the ability to influence through this repetition and this persuasion and this idea that everybody's talking about or thinking the same thing. So then the question becomes, how do we know that these are real people, real identities that are tied to this content? And so I think that the next thing that we'll be thinking about is actually that question, really. It's to what extent is, how are we going to think about identity in an era when faces are generated? When I spoke with Joe Rogan, this was in like March 2018. I said there's this website, this person does not exist.com, and it generates faces. The AI is generating faces, and each face is different.
Hmm.
So if you reverse image search it, nobody's going to find it because it's not a stock photo and it's not a real person. And as that technology improves, again, you can create personas with these computer generated faces that are untraceable. And we've already seen 3 or 4 influence operations. I was talking about it with Rogan in March of 2018. November of 20. Sorry, I was talking about. I spoke with him about it in March of 2019.
Hmm.
Okay, let me say that again. So I was
Yeah, this
talking
year's
with
been 5 years long. It's
right.
fine. So it's really confusing, being that 2020, yeah, has been at least 3 to 5 years in my perception.
So I was having this conversation about this technology in March of 2019, and in November 2019, we had the first takedown based on this, a network of pages that were attributable to an entity affiliated with the Epic Times called the BL. I think it stood for the Beautiful Life or something. One of these kind of fake, fake is not the word, one of these like kind of spammy Facebook pages
Okay.
was creating personas to share their articles. And so these were fake accounts with AI generated faces to just produce, going into groups and sharing content affiliated with this publication. So we've already seen ways in which people who want to manipulate are using all of these different technologies as they become available. And so the question becomes, okay, how do we think about in advance what kinds of frameworks we're going to want to see to ensure that people can trust the information and content that's in front of them, trust that that person who's saying it is real.
Yeah, I mean that's the challenge. And then as we move into VR, it's like and add another layer where like voice and video, like face and everything is fake. It seems like a pretty uphill battle. Renee, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. It's enlightening. It's also a little disturbing because it almost seems, how optimistic are you that we're going to be able to solve this? Like, what happens in other countries like Estonia that have been hit with Russian influence operations for decades? Like, are they doing okay, or is it just nobody trusts anything they see ever?
I think there are certain countries that have a higher degree of trust in government than we do right now, right? So, like Sweden has been a target for operations, but people trust the government. When the government says this is how these operations look, people internalize that and then they feel better educated and the impact is less. That doesn't happen here, unfortunately. It turns into well, this political party said it's a thing, and this political party, just is saying it because they hate that other political party. So it's become a partisan debacle here. I think I'm optimistic. Look, people have adapted to emergent technologies before. Propaganda's been around for a very long time. I think the question becomes, do we have are we sufficiently prioritizing making changes to improve our information environment, right? To recognize that this is the new normal, and how do we want to adapt to that? Either by way of regulation or by way of changes, making algorithms more understanding of the downstream impacts that they have. So I think that that's kind of where we are today. I wouldn't say solve. I don't think that you solve disinformation. I think it's more like a chronic condition, right? You manage it, you adapt to it, you help the population be resilient to it. And that's where we have to be going.
Renee DiResta, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hope y'all enjoyed that. You can find a lot more just like this in the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed, which you can find in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Now click here for a little change of pace with actor Danny Trejo, or right here for more election hacking with actual computer hacker Harry Hursty. He talks about the vulnerabilities of election machines. And of course, click here to subscribe to the channel.